Say what you want about Apple, but their 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro is pretty impressive. This particular M1 Max variant has 10 CPU cores, 32 GPU cores, and 32 GB of unified memory, making it currently the most powerful MacBook ever. But how does it stack up against the competition? Are MacBooks now more powerful than Windows laptops? Well, let's find out. Also, quick thanks to Motion VFX for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. Representing Team PC is the Vapor 17X Plus from Aftershock, featuring an Intel 12900H CPU, 32GB of DDR5 RAM, and an RTX 3080Ti GPU with 16GB of memory. It's also specially tuned by Aftershock themselves to maximize performance. Now, if you're not familiar with this particular laptop, in other countries it's known as the Max 17 from Electronics. Anyway, this is one of the most powerful laptops you can get right now, and I'm going to compare it with the M1 Max in everything from gaming, 3D modeling, video editing, creative workflows using Adobe Apps, and we're also going to discuss some of the negatives of both platforms. Also, make sure you pause the video and add a comment down below and tell me which one you think is going to win and why. Now, the 17X's 3080Ti GPU has a massive 175 watt power limit, which is the highest you can possibly get in a laptop. Why is this important, you might ask? Well, there are a lot of laptops out there where the GPU power limit is set much lower, sometimes at only 100 watts. And this is going to significantly decrease the performance of the GPU. Now, although these laptops are typically geared towards different target audiences, and they of course have many differences, the purpose of this video is simply to find out how they compare in pure performance. I'm not interested in comparing the operating systems or build quality, battery life, or even screen size. That's an entirely separate video. I simply want to see how the M1 Max chip stacks up against the combined power of an Intel 12900H and RTX 3080 Ti with max TDP. So full disclosure here, I bought the MacBook with my own money. The Vapor 17X was sent to me by Aftershock. It's a review unit, so I have to send it back. I don't get to keep it. And also, I use both Windows and Macs on a daily basis, and I have done so for the last 10 years. I enjoy using both, and I don't really have a bias towards either one, so I'm trying my best to stay as unbiased as possible in this video. Now, even though this video is just about performance only, I wanted to set the tone with pricing because it is still very important. The fully spec'd M1 Max is going to cost you at minimum $3,500 US, or almost $4,000 US if you get the 2TB SSD to match the Vapor 17X. For reference, the Vapor comes in at around $3,000 US. Now, that is a fairly significant price difference, so just keep that in the back of your mind throughout the rest of this video. Okay, let's start with some synthetic benchmarks for the CPUs. Starting with Cinebench multi-core scores, the 12900H was able to outperform the M1 Max by 38%, which is a significant amount, but synthetic benchmarks don't tell the full story, and I'll show you why later on. For single-core scores, again, the 12900H comes out ahead by 25%. Now, you will likely notice this single core difference if your workflow depends more on the speed of individual cores, like many Photoshop workflows, and some programs that rely heavily on plugins, for example. Also, let me explain some of the differences in performance between the two CPUs. Firstly, note that the 12900H has 14 cores compared with 10 on the M1 Max. And if we break this down further, the M1 Max has 8 high-performance cores versus just 6 on the Intel. However, the performance cores on the Intel have much higher clock speeds, can turbo boost unlike the M1 Max, and can also be combined with the efficiency cores for hyper-threading tasks. So even though the 12900H needs more power, pulling around 85 watts compared to 30 for the M1 Max during the Cinebench multi-core benchmark, the 12900H is undeniably a more powerful CPU, but it does come at the cost of efficiency, but more on that later. Next up, we have coding and development. Now, I know that you probably won't be buying this particular Intel laptop specifically for coding, but let's just compare anyway. As you can see, the M1 Max is able to compile quicker because at the end of the day, it was created with this workflow in mind, unlike the 12900H. Although if you're not compiling large codebases frequently, either machine will work fine. So what about creative workflows? Well, let's start with After Effects. And before you ask, yes, Adobe finally pulled their finger out and updated After Effects to have native Apple Silicon support. Using Puget Bench, which tests a whole range of real-life After Effects workflows, the M1 Max came out slightly ahead. Looking at these scores in more detail, the Intel CPU outperforms the M1 Max at multi-core, and the M1 Max comes out ahead for tracking, but what I found really interesting was those GPU scores. They're almost identical, so as much as we love to hate on Adobe, they've done a pretty good optimization job here. Moving to a real-life project, here's a 2D animation that I use at the end of some YouTube videos. The M1 Max was able to render this 18 seconds faster. Now, After Effects can be extremely RAM intensive. Both the Intel laptop and the MacBook have DDR5 memory. Although the M1 Max's is clocked higher at 6400 MHz compared to 48 MHz on the Vapor. But the M1 Max's memory can be accessed at 400 gigabits per second. And don't forget that because this memory is also unified, the entire system can access all 32 gigabytes, including the GPU cores, compared with just 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory on the RTX 3080 Ti. This helps explain why the GPU performance of the M1 Max is so impressive, but again, more on that later. Next, we have Premiere Pro, where both systems performed almost identically, and breaking this down further, the M1 Max comes out ahead when exporting, but the Intel laptop is better at everything else, especially live playback and anything GPU related. Wrapping up the Adobe apps, Lightroom and Photoshop performed about the same. I doubt you'll notice a difference on either system, so to save time, I didn't go into much detail. Alright, let's take a look at video editing. I'm using the latest version of DaVinci Resolve Studio on both machines. Starting with a multicam project, here we have 4 streams of really demanding color-corrected 4K footage from assorted GoPro, Sony, and Blackmagic cameras. The most important factor for video editing is timeline performance, so let's look at that first. Timeline playback was very similar, but when scrubbing, the M1 Max was a little bit smoother, as you can see on screen at the moment, likely due to its hardware video decoders kicking in for the H.264, HEVC, and ProRes footage I was using. When rendering out this 20-minute timeline in 4K and H.264, the M1 Max is also superior, but by a larger margin this time, again due to those hardware encoders. Moving on to some of the most hardcore footage you can find, and that is 4K 120fps footage from the Sony a7S Mark III. It's so hardcore in fact that you need to spend a few $100 on a specialized CF Express Type A card just to shoot it. Playback and scrubbing was similar between the two. I couldn't really tell a difference. But if we add stabilization to this 2.5 minute clip, however, the M1 Max comes out ahead. Now, switching over to 8K Red RAW footage from a Red camera, real-time playback and scrubbing is about the same with a timeline resolution of 4K, but when rendering this 2-minute project in 8K DNxHR 444 10-bit, which is a codec more oriented to Windows workflows, the Vapor laptop destroys the M1 Max, because the M1 Max can't take advantage of its hardware decoders due to the incompatible codec. So if you can take advantage of the M1 Max's specific footage optimizations, so your H.264, your ProRes for example, it is going to outperform the Intel and RTX laptop, but if you can't take advantage of those things, the Windows laptop is going to be the better performer. While we're on the topic of editing, if you use Final Cut Pro, there's a website called Motion VFX that has a ton of high quality transitions, plugins, stock footage, templates, and more. Don't use Final Cut, that's okay, there's some Resolve and Premiere content too. I edited this particular video using Final Cut Pro, and you can actually see some of the Motion VFX transitions in action. All you have to do is browse the Motion VFX website for a template, transition, or pack you want. For example, the M Transition Mega Pack with 140 different transitions to use on your footage. And once you've purchased the pack, you can simply download it and add it to your video editing program with a few clicks of a button. And from there, just drag and drop whatever you want onto your timeline. And I can't stress just how easy and efficient this entire process is. I've used it throughout this entire video. There's no messing around in Fusion, there's no keyframes, it's all just there, ready to go. So make sure you check out Motion VFX using the link below and use code CREATED to get 10% off. Okay, time for the M1 Max to start taking some massive L's. So PC fanboys, this is the moment you've been waiting for. Let's take a look at Blender first. I'm using Blender 3.1 on both devices, which introduces Metal GPU support for cycles rendering on Apple Silicon Macs. When rendering with the CPU only, both systems perform about the same, just like what we saw with the Cinebench scores. But this isn't realistic as most renders are done using the GPU. So when switching to GPU rendering, the M1 Max gets absolutely obliterated. You can see the impact of this when rendering the barbershop demo scene. Sure, it may only be a few minutes in this example, but for more complicated renders, the difference could be hours. The RTX 3080 Ti is just simply more optimized for this workflow because it uses optics, which takes advantage of the ray tracing cores in the NVIDIA GPU to improve 3D rendering performance, among other things. We also see these same performance gaps in software such as Cinema 4D Redshift. Now, again, these 3D modeling programs are not yet fully optimized for Apple Silicon, so in the future we may very well get a ton of updates and additional support. But for right now, you're just not going to see Apple Silicon come anywhere close to anything with an RTX sticker on it. Now, to keep this comparison fair, we also have to have a chat about gaming. Now, I know this is a pretty controversial topic, so make sure you guys get down into the comments and go crazy. Spoiler alert, Macs suck at gaming. There are a number of reasons why, like Apple using their own Metal API instead of more popular ones like OpenGL or Vulkan. But to keep this video relatively compact, if you want to learn more about that, I'll link a separate video. Anyway, what if the M1 Max had the potential, at least, to be good at gaming? Doing a synthetic benchmark on GFX Bench when Apple's preferred API, which is Metal, is selected for the M1 Max, and DirectX 12 for the RTX laptop, their performance is actually similar. So if you play Metal-optimized games like Baldur's Gate 3 or World of Warcraft, for example, you won't see much difference between the two platforms. Unfortunately, the reality is only a tiny percentage of games support Metal, and any other games available on macOS, for example those using the OpenGL API, are typically also being emulated via Rosetta 2. So to give you a realistic idea of what the typical gaming performance difference will be, let's look at games like Tomb Raider, which is actually a best case scenario because it does in fact have some Metal support. Although, as you'll see, that still doesn't help much. The RTX 3080 Ti achieved a significantly higher FPS score. Other games like CSGO are pretty much the exact same. It's just not a pleasant experience, only getting barely 100 FPS on a game that can be usually easily run at over 300 FPS. Now, there are of course other major differences like screen refresh rate and response time, for example, but again, this video is just about performance. And it seems like, at least on the hardware level, the M1 Max is capable of decent gaming performance, but the support and the optimization just isn't there yet. Okay, let's stop crapping on the Mac for a second and look at some negatives of the RTX laptops. It's just like Uncle Ben said in the first Spider-Man movie. With great power comes great power draw and heat output? That doesn't sound right. Anyway, let's start with fan noise. Regardless of manufacturer, the Intel and RTX laptops get really loud. The 16-inch M1 Max MacBook's fans aren't silent, but they are considerably less loud and often won't even turn on until absolutely necessary. You'll also get a lot more heat produced on the Intel and RTX laptops, especially from the GPU, with a lot of this transferring directly to and heating up the chassis of the laptop. The Mac just seems to run cooler. Finally, we come to the biggest con of the RTX laptops in my opinion, and that is power draw. To give you an example, I compared the total power draw from the wall both laptops used while running the Aztec Ruins benchmark. The M1 Max barely sipped 90 watts, while the RTX laptop needed almost 260, which is roughly 3 times more. And don't forget that both of these laptops performed about the same on this benchmark. And if I disconnect the RTX laptop from its charger and run some of the same benchmarks on battery alone, you can see performance drops significantly. But it doesn't for the M1 Max because it's extremely efficient and the battery is able to provide enough wattage. So for some people, even though the M1 Max still falls short in raw Blender or Cinema 4D performance, for example, the ability to get full performance out of the chip while on battery and being mobile is still preferable to the increased performance of the RTX laptop. So yeah, really interesting to compare these two machines. I think this last year, the 12th gen Intel laptops have really improved over the previous generation, like this Vapor 17X Plus. Really solid laptop. If you guys are located in Australia, I will link it down below if you want to check it out. And I also think it's really interesting just how powerful MacBooks have become with the introduction of Apple Silicon. So if you remember back to previous generations of the MacBook, they were pretty crap in my opinion. So this is early 2020, and prior to that, they really weren't that great. They suffered from the same heat issues. They were thermal throttling a lot due to the design. They were also quite expensive compared to a lot of their Windows counterparts. But now they're competing with these ultra-powerful Windows laptops while also producing less noise, less heat, and needing less power. And sure, I mean, the M1 Max is far from perfect. There's a lack of software and optimization support in workflows like 3D modeling and gaming, and just lack of software in general. But if those things aren't important to you, I think it's a tough decision between the two if you're still currently on the fence about which one you want to go with. But apart from that, hopefully you enjoyed this comparison video, and I'll catch you in the next one.